27 miles west of Pittsburgh, on a private farm, there is a hole in a hillside that most Americans have never heard of. You could drive past it. Thousands of people do. It looks like nothing. A lip of sandstone leaning out over a creek bed, the kind of overhang you find all over the Appalachian foothills. Underneath it is the oldest evidence of human beings ever found on American soil. And in August of 2025, scientists were still standing inside it, still arguing about what it means. Because the question buried in that hillside is not a small one. It is this: how long have people actually been on this continent? And who decided what the answer was allowed to be? If you went to school in America in the 20th century, you were taught this. The first Americans arrived about 11,000 years ago, a people called Clovis, named for their spear points. They crossed a land bridge from Siberia, and nobody was here before them. That was not taught as a theory, it was taught as a fact. Now hold that number, 11,000, because the deepest layer under that Pennsylvania overhang has produced a date of 19,600 years. The gap between those two numbers is longer than the entire recorded history of Egypt. And here is what that gap actually opens up. 11,000 years ago, this continent was almost empty of monsters. 19,000 years ago, it was full of them. North America in that window belonged to giants. Mammoths and mastodons moving through the valleys, ground sloths that stood taller than a man when they reared up, short-faced bears, beavers the size of black bears, dire wolves, American lions. So the real question underneath this hillside is not a number on a page, it is this. Did people walk this land while the giants were still alive, hunting them, avoiding them, sitting under that overhang in a country that still had monsters in it? Or did they only arrive afterwards, into an emptied landscape where the great bones were already buried and gone? 11,000 years puts humans at the funeral. 19,000 puts them in the room while it was still happening. Nobody has settled which, and it means something heavier still, because the people under that rock were the direct ancestors of Native Americans, which turns an argument about carbon dating into an argument about how long the first peoples of this continent have actually been here. That is what has been fought over for 50 years. And that is why the fight got as ugly as it did. The story starts with a secret. In November of 1955, a farmer named Albert Miller was walking his land near Avella in Washington County. His family had farmed that ground since the 1700s. At the back of the rock shelter, a groundhog had dug a burrow, and the animal had thrown material out onto the surface. Miller looked closer. Burnt bone, worked flint, he dug down with his hands. About 12 inches in, he knew exactly what he had. At roughly 30 inches, he pulled out a complete flint knife, and then he covered the hole back up. For 17 years, Albert Miller told almost nobody, not because he wanted to profit from it, because looters had already stripped sites across that region, and he understood that the moment word got out, the shelter would be destroyed by people with shovels and no training. So he waited. 17 years, sitting on the most important thing he would ever find, keeping it hidden on purpose, waiting for someone qualified enough to deserve it. That is the first thing that was hidden here. It will not be the last. In the spring of 1973, Miller was finally introduced to a 29-year-old archaeologist at the University of Pittsburgh named James Adovasio. Adovasio was not expecting anything remarkable. He needed a training site for a field school. His professional estimate, before he broke ground, was that there might be less than a meter of deposits, some late archaic material, maybe early woodland pottery. He would spend the next 50 years of his life defending what came out of that ground. To understand why, you need to understand what a rock shelter does. It is not a cave, it is an overhang, and it rains dust. The ceiling sheds fine particles continuously, year after year, century after century, and that falling material buries whatever is on the floor beneath it, slowly, evenly, without mixing. Which means the floor of a rock shelter is not a floor, it is a stack, a physical archive, laid down in order. At Meadowcroft, that stack runs 11 distinct natural layers deep and reaches roughly 11.5 feet down, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. Archaeologists call this the law of superposition, and it is as close to a law of physics as archaeology gets, so they went down through it, extremely carefully. Every artifact was plotted in 3 dimensions against fixed reference points. Thin occupation surfaces were peeled apart using single-edged razor blades. Sediment grain sizes were measured on site. Data went from the trench to a university mainframe over a telephone line, which had never been done inside a rock shelter before. A custom lighting rig was built with engineers so the layer walls could be recorded without shadows distorting them. Because when the attacks came, they came from every direction except this one. In half a century of argument, almost no critic has ever questioned how Meadowcroft was excavated. They questioned what the ground was allowed to say. What came out was extraordinary. Animal remains representing 149 species. Plant material preserved unusually well. Stone tools that matched nothing from any later period in the region, including a distinctive unfluted spear point, now called the Miller lanceolate, named for the farmer who kept the secret. And the raw materials told their own story. Chert from West Virginia, chert from New York, chert from Ohio, jasper from eastern Pennsylvania, marine shell from the Atlantic coast hundreds of miles away. These were not isolated people scraping by at the edge of an ice sheet. Whoever sat under that overhang was plugged into a network that stretched across half of what is now the eastern United States. There was also a fragment of birch bark, cut into strips and plaited into a woven wall. It is the oldest basketry ever recovered in eastern North America. Then the charcoal from the deepest fire pits came back from the laboratory. 52 radiocarbon dates were eventually run at Meadowcroft. Apart from a few minor reversals in the youngest deposits, they fell in correct stratigraphic order, top to bottom, exactly as they should if the sequence had never been disturbed. The lower levels indicated a human presence in southwestern Pennsylvania by at least 14,000 to 14,500 years ago. And the single deepest sample, a cut fragment of bark from the very bottom, returned 19,600 years, plus or minus 2,400. Hold on to that second number, plus or minus 2,400. That margin is going to matter enormously, and the people who attacked this site were not wrong to notice it. What happened next was not curiosity, it was closer to a prosecution. The lead objection came from a geoarchaeologist named C. Vance Haynes, Jr. at the University of Arizona, and scientifically it was serious. His argument was about something called dead carbon. Here is why that matters, and it is worth understanding properly. Radiocarbon dating works because living things take in carbon-14 from the atmosphere while alive and stop when they die. The carbon-14 then decays at a fixed rate. Measure what is left, and you know how long ago that thing died. But carbon-14 has a ceiling. After about 50,000 years, there is effectively none left. Coal is hundreds of millions of years old. Coal contains no measurable carbon-14 at all. So if even a trace of coal contaminates your charcoal sample, the result does not come back slightly wrong. It comes back too old, and Meadowcroft sits in western Pennsylvania. Coal country. Haynes proposed that dissolved carbon compounds from ancient coal in the surrounding bedrock could have traveled through groundwater into those fire pits, inflating the ages by perhaps 4,000 to 4,500 years. Kenneth Tankersley and Cheryl Ann Munson published papers in 1987 and again in 1992 arguing that specific tests were required before anybody accepted the numbers. Nobody accused Adovasio of lying. What they said was, for a scientist, arguably worse. They said his numbers were contaminated. That the most carefully excavated site in North America had produced dates that meant nothing at all. And there was a second attack, which had nothing to do with chemistry. If people were under that overhang 19,000 years ago, they were near a glacier front only tens of miles north. The plants and animals in those layers should look like Ice Age plants and animals. Spruce, boreal forest, cold-adapted species. They did not. The deep layers are dominated by oak, hickory, and walnut. A temperate forest. The kind of woodland you could walk through in Pennsylvania this afternoon. Critics said this was the wrong environment, therefore wrong dates. Adovasio's answer was that the assumption itself was too crude. The landscape south of the ice was never one uniform frozen band. It was patchy, varied, and locally sheltered, and a protected valley could hold a pocket of temperate species that the models had simply never allowed for. That argument ran for 20 years. So why not just test for the coal? They did. There is no coal seam in or near the shelter. What exists are small, isolated fragments of fossilized ancient wood, more than 7 meters from the fire pits, separated from the occupation floors by 30 to 50 centimeters of undisturbed sediment. That material does not dissolve in water, which means it could only contaminate a sample as a physical particle. So they hunted for particles. Every radiometric sample from the Pleistocene levels was examined optically and under a scanning electron microscope by 4 separate radiocarbon laboratories and by independent researchers. Selected samples underwent reflectance analysis, a technique borrowed from coal petrography, and were screened for coal diagnostic fossil spores. No coal particles were found, not in a single sample, and there was a logic problem the contamination theory never answered. If coal was seeping in and corrupting the deepest dates, why did it stop? Why were all 52 dates above them in correct order, with the younger levels reading correctly young? Then in 1999, two outside geoarchaeologists, Paul Goldberg and Trina Arpin, did something nobody on either side had done. They took thin slices of the actual sediment and examined its microscopic structure directly. They were independent. They had no stake in the outcome. Their finding was that the deposits formed by dust fall, roof collapse, and sheet wash, exactly as the excavators had described. And critically, they found no evidence of groundwater ever moving through the early levels, which removes the vehicle. Without moving groundwater, dissolved carbon has no way to travel. And here the story stops behaving like a normal scientific dispute. Nobody surrendered. There was no retraction, no press conference, no moment where the field admitted it had been wrong. In 1999, Adovasio's own team described what had become of the opposition in one dry sentence. Many once vocal critics, they wrote, had become silent, bored, or perhaps both. That is how it ended, not with vindication, with exhaustion. Meanwhile, the ground shifted underneath everyone. In 1997, a panel of specialists traveled to Monteverde in Chile and agreed it was genuine and roughly 14,500 years old. The Clovis barrier cracked. Then in 2021, fossil human footprints at White Sands in New Mexico were dated to between 21 and 23,000 years ago, independently confirmed in 2023 using ancient pollen and a technique that measures when quartz grains last saw sunlight, and confirmed again in 2025 using a third method entirely. Understand what that means. The numbers that made Adovasio a pariah in the 1970s are in 2026 no longer the outlier. Other American sites now read older, and the field is still split. The most recent survey of professional opinion shows roughly 38% accepting Meadowcroft's oldest dates. Roughly the same number unsure. Around 20% still saying no. 50 years, and nobody has closed it. There is one more turn, and almost nobody talks about it. In 2022, a paper appeared in the journal Radiocarbon. The authors were John Hart of the New York State Museum and Adovasio himself. They had taken 17 preserved maize specimens from the upper layers, corn long assumed to be roughly 2,000 years old, and dated the maize directly instead of the charcoal beside it. Every single sample came back historical, most likely after 1800 AD. The corn had moved. It had worked its way down through the deposits by burrowing animals or root action, and the excavators had never detected it. Read that again, because it cuts both ways. The team that spent 50 years insisting nothing at Meadowcroft had moved, published proof that at Meadowcroft something had moved. It concerns only the upper layers and does not touch the deep sequence. They found it themselves. They printed it anyway. That is what separates this from a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories never correct themselves. There was one final attempt to end the argument. In 2019, a researcher in a hazmat suit collected sediment cubes from the deepest part of the excavation and sent them to a genetics laboratory in Copenhagen, hoping to pull ancient human DNA straight out of the dirt. If it had worked, it would have settled everything. It found nothing. No human DNA. No animal DNA. No plant DNA. The result was never formally published. The ground simply refused to answer. The shelter is still there. In August of 2025, a team went back in to stabilize the eastern wall and scanned the entire profile with lasers to build a three-dimensional record. They recovered a flint tool estimated at over 3,000 years old, along with charcoal, seeds, and small mammal bones. And more than one-third of that site has never been excavated at all. That was deliberate. It was left in the ground on purpose, sealed, untouched, for technologies that have not been invented yet. Which means that right now, tonight, under a farm in western Pennsylvania, there are layers holding answers that no living person has seen. That is the real weight of Meadowcroft, and it is why it still matters. The oldest date from that shelter carries a margin of error of 2,400 years. It is not a fact, it is a measurement, taken with the tools of one particular decade, and it has a range. Everything archaeology can tell us about when people arrived on this continent is a minimum, not the date humans got here. The date the evidence happens to survive from, in the few places we have happened to look. Albert Miller found the doorway to that record because an animal dug a hole in a hillside, and because one farmer chose to keep a secret for 17 years until the right person came along. There is no reason to believe that was the last one. This country is covered in hillsides nobody has ever examined, holding layers nobody has ever counted, waiting for a technology that does not exist yet, or for somebody patient enough to keep quiet until it does. If you want more discoveries that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about this continent, subscribe and stay with us. Tell us in the comments what you think is still buried out there. Until next time, keep looking down.